and got a good heart. Don't let his size fool you. He's going to be a teddy bear. I have to give the brother credit. He is feeling under the weather today, so bear that in mind. He's not firing on all cylinders. I think he's getting cold or something's going on, but he's still standing strong and here and filling out his obligations. So we appreciate that. He is Brother Barry Eastham. He is at the Grand Lodge of Kentucky. He's what were you there? In the Grand Lodge?
Oh, in Atlanta, I served, my brother was pastor, was Grand Master, I served as Marshal.
He's a Master Mason, past Master of his Lodge, 33rd degree, Scottish Rite Freemason, KYCH, Knights Templar, and served the Grand Lodge, and he loves the craft, and he is a true man of Mason. And without further ado, I will turn the floor over to you, Brother Eastham. If you have as much time as possible, just do what my congregation tells me, keep it under 20 minutes.
Yeah.
You don't worry about it.
I was getting ready to say, I got to go to church with him in the morning. I promised him I'd sit in the back of the room going.
I was preaching one time, I took the clock off the wall.
I remember that story. It is good. James, thanks for asking me to come down here today, and I'd like to thank you, brothers and friends, for being here today too. Now, I have two papers. One I had previously given to a district meeting, and I had to modify it. Actually, both of them I had to slightly modify, knowing this was an open meeting. And then trying to straddle that line, if you're not a Mason, in Carolina, in specific, you may not find this really interesting, but I've really tried to do my best. So I'll apologize up front if it falls short in that respect. The first one that I'd like to deliver is called East of the Altar. And we, during our Masonic careers, we're always called West of the Altar as candidates. But it's a perspective that I would like to elaborate on when you're the one presiding. Like many of Masons who hold a keen interest in the craft, I have received most of the degrees that are available to all of us, like I'm sure most of you all have too. And I, like you, have had certain experiences and memories associated with them that will remain with me till the day I die. For certain, two of the most memorable for me are the Master Mason's degree and the Order of the Temple. I was very fortunate to be able to take my craft and Yorkright degrees by myself, just one man, which I think is very conducive to the student contemplating what is going on without being distracted by others around him. You have a special sense also that what is going on is happening just for you. I remember the feelings of confusion, curiosity, happiness, pride, and yes, even fear at certain points. But after receiving these degrees and progressing through the various lines, which becomes so much more attractive when the initial work is done in an exemplary form, I've had the opportunity, or should I say the honor, of conferring these degrees and seeing these things from the east side of the altar. We all approach and are called west of the altar as brothers and as candidates several times during our Masonic journey. But it is the perspective gained from viewing things looking from the east of the altar on which I wish to elaborate, not merely as the one who is presiding, but the one who is actually conferring the work. For those of you who have not had the opportunity to confer degrees, I highly recommend it. Not only do you benefit from the increased knowledge that you necessarily gain by being proficient in the work, you also gain an ineffable perspective on what is going on around you, as well as an interesting insight into the human psyche. They say that the eyes are the windows to the soul. And once you look into the eyes of your candidates, you'll quickly understand what it is that I'm trying to say. You can begin with lectures in the Blue Lodge that are, I'm pretty sure, get done in your Blue Lodges here. Unfortunately, in the state of Kentucky, there are parts of the state where we only, lodges only do what they call the first section, and you guys know what I mean, and the lectures a lot of times are not being delivered. Now this is where you can really start to see this effect that I'm talking about. If you just simply watch the man that is taking these degrees, watch his eyes, as you try to explain our symbols and customs, think about what it is you see. Does he seem attentive, confused, not even interested? I've seen all these and more. It doesn't take long. You can begin to tell what sort of participation you will have from your candidate. I have seen guys look at me with a blank stare, it being obvious to me that he either has no interest or can't comprehend anything that I'm trying to tell him. I even had one guy look at his watch a couple times when we were trying to confer the degrees. Perhaps these craft degrees are stepping stones to the shrine or some other organization, or he just doesn't understand some of the archaic language that is retained in our rituals. But on the other end of the spectrum, sometimes I see guys that make an effort to not even break eye contact with you. They don't want to miss a single word. And it's as if they're almost afraid they'll miss something if they look away. Now these are especially gratifying, especially when you've taken the time to confer this work. Now, and the same is almost always said of these same gentlemen through all the degrees relating to craft masonry, through the craft, the chapter, and the council. Now the order of the temple that I spoke of earlier brings me to a different kind of reaction. And those of you who are Knights Templar know what I mean. The climactic moment in the order of the temple has precipitated so many different reactions I can't even list them all. The initial shock of the moment, however, is minuscule when compared to the most profound sense of solemnity and palpable magic that when the Sir Knight contemplates on this event that is getting ready to take place, he must needs be so impressed that he will carry such an event with him to the grave. Standing in the east as the preceptor or the commander, you know by looking at these men that they realize what is happening. And then the time comes when that it happens. You can clearly see it on their faces. I had my brother, older brother, like I said, was a past Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Kentucky. And I've held it over his head for quite some time. He was the oldest entered apprentice I knew. He joined the lodge, and he was an entered apprentice for like 7 or 8 years. And since he's my older brother, I always feel it's my job to keep him grounded, I guess I should say. But I always hold that over him. And I've actually had the honor of being able to confer most of his degrees on him. All of the York Rite degrees, all the way up to the Lodge of Perfection and the Scottish Rite. And when he went through the Order of the Temple, you know, he is a brother Mason, he's a Sir Knight, but he's my brother too. So I was watching his face. And we were on our way home that night, and he said, yeah, he said, I almost got up and left. And I said, well, you know, I kind of saw that in your face. Being a Venerable Master in the 14th degree line of the Scottish Rite, my position obviously is close to the altar, and I've been able to confer these degrees several times to date as well. Now those that are familiar with the Scottish Rite in the southern jurisdiction, the older rituals that were the pre-revision rituals we work now, there are certain questions that are asked of the candidate. And now one of these questions in particular afforded you another opportunity as Venerable Master to briefly look into another person's heart. Most all Venerable Masters that I have seen confer the 14th degree made very sure that they retained a very deliberate eye contact with each and every man as they approach west of the altar. And it's no wonder that people such as our parents, policemen, and our wives can even tell when you're lying. If you confer the 14th degree sometime, especially the old one, you'll become proficient in this yourself soon enough. Rolling eyes, downcast stares, and nervous twitching are all commonplace in the old 14th degree ritual, and it is a shame that this interrogation was not retained in the revisions. In our degrees in the Valley of Covington, each and every man in the class was taken west of the altar and asked this question individually. It is interesting to note that the first man questioned usually set the tone for the rest of the class. And I do not claim to be clairvoyant, but I am a realist, and the law of averages would suggest that a class of, say, 20 men, at least one would answer the question truthfully. But many times I've seen that the first man answer the question in the negative, and then all the rest simply follow suit. They just do what the first man does just so they can get through this and sit down. They don't want to bear anything of their soul. And I'm not judging. But when I think of the mindset I was in when I received the degree, I'm not so sure I would have been honest either. The other extreme of this occurs when the first man answers yes, and then the pattern shown is that a large percentage will answer the same as he did. And it took me a while to realize it, but the answer to the question given by any man while the degree was being conferred was not as important as how it made that man feel. Did he feel bolstered by the fact that he told the truth, be it good or bad? Perhaps he realized that he had been less than honest out of fear of what was going to happen or shame, and this was a catalyst for him to strive to be that much of a better man. And we can hopefully pray that this was so. Now, the paramount thing to remember, which I tell any person that I coach in any sort of ritual, is to remember that when you're doing this from the east side of the altar, you are a part of the chain. Now, this is more than a mere degree conferral. It is a transmission. What we do in these lodge rooms, and I don't care what degree it is, It's the entered apprentice or the 33rd. You are a part of a chain that has been going on for a very long time. And when you confer these degrees, it is your turn to be that link that passes it on to somebody else. To be professional, sincere, and knowledgeable is the best way to show your appreciation for someone taking out their time to do the same for you previously. In my older age, I've gotten a little more cranky on this subject. What people fail to realize is that to someone of my age, and like most guys in here, my time is infinitely more important to me than my money. If I'm here, I intend to do the best job I can, and I expect whoever it is to pay attention. Anyone in this room who's presided over any degree, I'm sure, can agree with that statement. So, being the presiding officer in the East in any degree is something that one must be experienced by all Masons, and I assure you, you will not forget it. You'll be surprised what you learn not only about your fellow man, but more importantly about yourself. For that is truly what we are here to do, is to make ourselves better. Not better than our neighbors, not better than our friends, but better than ourselves. And when you're standing on the east side of the altar, it's been my experience that this process is magnified, and if done properly, will help facilitate the process of internal alchemical change. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, he has one more presentation to give, and appreciate your patience. Go right ahead.
Right ahead. The second paper that I had prepared, this is more of a historical paper. I titled it Fringe Masonry, Not on the Fringe. And I stole the title from a famous one previously written by Elus in 1972 for the Quatuor Coronati transactions titled Fringe Masonry in England. And I modified the title just a bit. In the original paper, Elus detailed the history and interests of very colorful personalities of what is termed the golden age of occultism in Victorian England, along with their associated rights and degrees such as such as Memphis Mizraim, the Fratres Lucis, the Hermetic Order of Egypt, the Golden Dawn, the Sat Baha'i, and others. By being focused on the mid to late 1800s, his paper did not include any information on one of the most interesting of Masonic rites, the rite of the Elus Kohen. It would indeed be considered fringe today, but in its time, regardless of how small and select it was indeed quite regular and recognized in its own lands. The best description of the early life of our subject and the founder of this rite, Martinez de Pasquale, is given in the opening page of Trevor Stewart's publication of the book, Reintegration of Beings. So rather than reinvent the wheel, I will paraphrase that introduction here. Our story begins with the namesake of this paper, Martinez de Pasquale, being born in Notre Dame Parish of Grenoble around 1710. His full name appears on at least one register of the parish as, and you have to bear with me, I'm not sure I can pronounce this, Jacques de Lorient Joaquin Latour de la Casse Martinez de Pasquale. That was his full name. For our purposes, we will refer to him simply by Pasquale. By most accounts of researchers who have done the bulk of the work on researching him, it is guessed that the French was possibly not his native tongue due to the grammatical errors that abound in his magnum opus, The Reintegration of Beings, which will be discussed later on, as well as the fact that he used at least two secretaries that we know of, Abbe Fournier and Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin, for his correspondences. It was supposed that he was possibly Jewish at birth as well, but yet more grammatical errors, some very unforgiving, I'm told, abound in his use of the Hebrew language as well. At any rate, he was at least nominally adherent to the Catholic faith, was married in the parish church, and produced two sons of which nothing is known, but were most likely not alive for him to bequeath the peculiar Masonic system to when he died. We know that as early as 1754, when he was around age 44, he promoted his system of Freemasonry known as the Elus Kohen, which would roughly translate in English to elect priests. Scottish Rite Masons will be familiar with the word Elus from several degrees of the Lodge of Perfection. How was he promoting this rite? Well, Freemasonry in 1700s France was still Freemasonry, but you must understand that as far as facts go, all we know for sure is that the public face of the craft emerged in 1717, then spread to the continent and grew amongst the fertile grounds of the French and the volatile times during the years of the royal and political troubles in England, Scotland, and was still doing so in much later years, just prior to the American War between the states. During this time, just anterior to the formation of the Grand Lodge in England, the spread of Freemasonry was sometimes accomplished through individuals and sometimes even passed from father to son via patent or permission to spread the work. There was very little regulation, as we know it now, on the members of the craft, as much about members of the craft, as much about what we do now in our times was very far from being solidified or codified into Masonic law. It was in this fashion that Martinez began his system. He arrived in a very self-promotional manner at a lodge in Toulouse, bearing a large, elaborately decorated charter allegedly given to him from the exiled Prince Charles Edward Stuart, who was at this time still only a few years removed from his own failed return to England and Scotland from exile. This charter authorized him to promote his system and form lodges and temples accordingly, functioning as a Grand Inspector General of Freemasonry, another title familiar to Scottish Rite Masons. It is interesting to note, but well outside the scope of this paper, the ties that obviously exist between the Jacobites, the supporters of Bonnie Prince Charlie, and the return of his house to England and Scotland and the formation of the Scottish Rite, as well as this system and all the associated politics that go along with these systems that would seem very foreign to us today. This I bring up as a mere historical curiosity, and I will recommend there's an excellent paper on this subject in the Claremont Rite associated with the Rite of Strict Observance that was written by Brother David Lindes and is currently published in the 2014 Transactions of the Masonic Society. And if anybody's interested in reading that paper, it's very, very well written. I highly recommend it. His system, or rite, as we would call it, was eventually accepted, even after making such offensive claims to existing brothers that his purpose was indeed intended to replace what he called spurious masonry they were then practicing. Pasquale, like many Freemasons from then and now, felt that masonry had lost its way and it needed to be set back on the right track. He established temples, or lodges, in Foy, Avignon, Bordeaux, Metz, Montpellier, Paris, La Rochelle, and Versailles. He established 2 sovereign tribunals to control the order. This would be akin to having 2 supreme councils for, say, the southern jurisdiction. We're not quite sure why he had 2 governing tribunals. Maybe he didn't think one was more trustworthy than the other, but my own research into Pasquale shows little hints here and there of him being perhaps a little too overprotective of his order. This may or may not be justified depending on what frame you look at him through, but the signs are there. 2 tribunals or governing bodies does not really make a lot of sense. He withheld some ceremonies instructions from his own disciples, and this is documented fact. This indicates to me that he either didn't finish creating this system or he just didn't want to give it out in its entirety, which I still personally see happen today in various other mystical and occult orders. Leaders do still exist today in the world of mystical orders where said leader is the heir and title holder to literally hundreds of systems, degrees, and orders, but they are completely unwilling to share this wisdom with anyone else. Now, that aspect of the human mind hasn't changed from 1700s till now. He worked and fed this Masonic system until 1772 when he left for St. Domingo, and in an interesting turn, 7 years after he left for St. Domingo in 1779, which was 5 years after his death, his wife entered into a new marriage and retained contact with members of the Elus Kohen, of which she was a member. Now, this being a purely Masonic system bears more study. Remember that this was the mid-1700s, and co-masonry wasn't fashionable as a system until the rite of adoption, which records indicate wasn't even attempted until 1774, which could possibly have been a couple years after her initiation would have taken place, since he left in 1772. After he created the Elus Kohen, starting around 1754, saw its growth and spread, his departure for St. Domingo in what is now the Dominican Republic was by all accounts sudden, and purportedly had to do with administration of a plantation that he had received as an inheritance. He died 2 years later, thankfully for him, because he probably would not have wanted to have been present for the slave rebellion that took place on that island in 1791. Before his death, he appointed a successor, Cagné de Lestre, who died shortly thereafter before making any significant progress with the system. However, he also in turn appointed a successor before his death in the person of Sebastian de la Casas. It was under de la Casas that the order went into abeyance and eventually withered out not having the nurturing and instruction of its founder. The last of the temples closed around 1792, with no Reo Qua from the original order living as late as 1868. Now the order and its structure and practices. As stated, this rite of the Elus Kohen was a Masonic rite. It started with the entered apprentice degree and went on up to the degree of Reo Qua. From Gnostic.net, I pulled this thumbnail description of the degrees. The first class contained the normal 3 degrees of symbolic masonry, plus an additional degree of Grand Elect or Particular Master. The second class contained the so-called porch degrees of Apprentice Kohen, Fellow Kohen, and Master Kohen. It was typically Masonic, but contained hints of an underlying secret doctrine. The third class contained the temple degrees of Grand Master Elus Kohen, Knight of the East, and Commander of the East. Under the appearance of Masonry, its catechisms were based upon Martinez's general doctrine. The doctrine is expounded in Martinez's only book, The Reintegration of Beings, which is a pseudo-commentary on the Pentateuch. Purifying diets, similar to that of the Levites of the Old Testament, and rituals of exorcism were employed against evil in the individual and collectively in the world. The secret grade of the order was contained in the degree of Reo Qua, not to be confused with the Rose Qua, a term that was also known in Masonic and Rosicrucian circles at that time. In this degree of Reo Qua, the initiate is put in touch with spiritual planes beyond the physical through magical invocation or theurgy. He draws the celestial powers into his and the earth's aura. Auditory and visual manifestations called signs or passes enables the Reo Qua to evaluate his own evolution and that of other operators, and to determine thereby whether he or they have been reintegrated into their original powers. The grand object of the order was to obtain the beatific vision of the repairer, Jesus Christ, in response to magical evocations. Martinez conferred the title of sovereign judges of unknown superiors to only a few individuals, and they were Began de la Chevalier, Jean-Baptiste Willemose, de Serre, de Roy, de Hauterive, and de Lusignan. End quote. Pasquale's great and only work, The Reintegration of Beings, is, as stated above, a pseudo-commentary on the Pentateuch, but it makes an abrupt end before the story is complete, thus making it evident that he died before completing this work. The work was said to have been given to his disciples of the highest rank, the Reo Qua. In it, a very beautiful, complicated, and interesting cosmogony and theology is developed, which is, in my own words, extremely unique in the world of both occult theory and standard biblical commentary. With my own admittedly limited resources that I can research and that I have access to, I can say I can find nothing else like it anywhere else. Legend has it that his doctrines came from a group known as the Asiatic Brethren or elsewhere, but these are all mere stories, and I have never seen anything on paper to prove this statement without doubt. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but I've never seen it. Hints of standard Kabbalistic theology and design are everywhere in the system, but the system merely skirts the outside of this belief system without actually getting into it in a manner that would be familiar to occultists of the day. Likewise, the theurgical practices given to the adherents of the rite are obviously taken from the medieval magical text called the Heptameron, a grimoire having a probable origin of around the 12 to 1300s, but also have just enough massaging to make them unique in their own right when you compare the two. So what exactly did Pasquale try to teach in his Masonic rite? In essence, as outlined in his work, he teaches that Adam, the prototype of man, was created by God and sent to earth to be a jailer of sorts for what is called the prevaricated spirits, i.e. those who rebelled against God, earth being their jail. While they're conducting his duties, he falls prey to the whisperings of the demons and is told that he too can create, as the Father did, and he in turn creates woman, after which he is punished, and another agent is sent to take his place as jailer, that other agent being the repairer of Jesus Christ. This fall from grace is man's current spiritual state, and his return or reintegration must be achieved through a complex series of invocations, prayers, and rituals that are designed to bring him back to the estate which he lost, but having been lost through his own will. That, in a nutshell, is the description of the belief system. Now, this was to be accomplished specifically through 10 rites or operations, which were as follows. the rite of expiation, or atonement for wrongdoing, the rite of general particular grace, that being the doctrine that God has favor on particular people, such as in Genesis 6:8, where it says Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So in this case, that favor would be for the Elus Kohen. Number 3, the rite of operations against demons. Number 4, the rite of prevarication and conservation, or defense against lying spirits. Number 5, the rite against war. Number 6, the right of opposition to enemies of the divine law. Number 7, the right to obtain the descent of the divine spirit. Number 8, the right of strengthening of faith and perseverance in divine spiritual virtue. Number 9, the right for fixing of the conciliating spirit in oneself. And number 10, the right of annual dedication of all the operations to the Creator. Each one of these rites had an accompanying ritual designed to raise the operator's awareness to a level of receptivity of divine truth, thus enabling him or her to attain that reunion or reintegration. Now, you need to understand that these rites or rituals were done in the manner of a medieval magician. Consecrated clothing, weapons, casting circles on the floor, all these things were needed. A purifying diet was prescribed, similar to that of Old Testament priests. Magical circles were then cast on the floor, outside of which the operator would never stray, lest he incur the wrath of whatever it was he was invoking, and then exorcise him. Certain times of the year and days were employed to ensure success in these operations, being also loosely tied to the original source of the rite, the heptameron, and in turn relying upon astrological correspondences to achieve the desired results. What small pieces of the original system that remain to us today show a very, very lengthy preparation process, which in turn is small in comparison to the physical requirements and time needed to complete them as instructed. In other words, I don't think that anyone with a family or a job in today's modern world would be able to efficiently or successfully perform the rituals as they were worked during the time of Pasquale. Now, the Kohen did indeed meet in temples, or what we would call lodge, but the majority of ceremonial work was done alone and in private by the individual. So now, in your mind's eye, picture a darkened room, lit only with candles, a white chalk circle on the floor, Hebrew letters and Kabbalistic symbols etched on the perimeter, the operator standing in the center, flowing white robes with his magical sword, intoning various names of God, imploring his protection, invoking demons, and then banishing them from the presence of the earth and the operator's aura. Now picture all of this, and then picture the last piece that is of interest to us, is that he's wearing his Masonic apron of his rank over all of his regalia. It would have been a sight to behold and very strange for us to comprehend today, but remember, at this time, this was a legitimate Masonic rite, no different in terms of recognition than our own Scottish rite or York rite. Now, the vestiges that remain today of the Elus Kohen, much like the Enochian system of John Dee, was fragmented, and to our knowledge, the complete system as he worked and promoted it amongst his disciples no longer exists. There are, however, various groups, both Masonic and non-Masonic, that carry this torch today. Now, the first of these is the rectified Scottish rite, sometimes called the CBCS, which is French abbreviation for Chevalier Bonfaison de la Cité Sainte, or Knights Beneficent of the Holy City. Of all the disciples of Pasquale, 2 are of particular note. The first we mention here, he was John Baptiste Willimose. First initiated into the Elus Kohen in 1767. After Pasquale's death, he took the doctrine of the Elus Kohen, kept the Masonic context, removed the ceremonial magic, added a dash of Templarism and chivalry, and that body still exists in a recognized Masonic form today in the aforementioned CBCS. Most bodies gaining their regularity from the Great Priory of Helvetia, which kept the rite safe during the years of World War II. In the USA, there was a movement a few years ago to bring this body back to the masses, so to speak, since the national body was so exclusive. The movement did not achieve its original intent, but the original one does still exist and retains its charter and meets annually in Washington, D.C. But to my knowledge, the grades I don't think are worked, but I'm not a member, so I can't be sure of that. The second of Pasquale's most notable disciples was a man named Louis Claude de Saint Martin, or Saint Martin, the namesake of the Order of Martists. Saint Martin had an interesting life, both pre- and post-Kohen initiation, but eventually he forsook the operations of the Kohen and opted for what he styled the way of the heart, a more introspective form of mystical Christianity. He felt that the operations of the Cohens were at best too convoluted, evinced by his comment to his master Pasquale when he asked about all the regalia and the rituals. He said, "Is all this absolutely necessary to know God?" At worst, he felt the operations were dangerous, putting the operator in too close a contact with the very demons and spirits that had tempted Adam into the fall. When he came to this decision, he not only walked away from the Kohen, but also from Freemasonry proper. He eschewed all societies and orders and opted for a pure, simple, straightforward approach of mystical Christianity, introspection, and meditation. Although he left, he never had a cross word to say about his former master or his doctrines. On the contrary, he claimed that Pasquale had the key of which Jacob Boehme, the Christian mystic, also held. His philosophies were expanded upon and added to, and to this day exists as the Martinist order, which has far too many variations to list, some Masonic, some are not. It is an ironic twist that such an order has developed from the teachings of a man who tried to teach his disciples that such orders were not necessary or even desired. It is my personal belief that St. Martin would either be very upset at this modern scenario, or in the least, he would probably have a good chuckle over it. But this brings me to the last point of interest in this paper, and that would be the modern variations of the Elu Kohen proper that still exist today. In short, yes, they do. All one needs to do is scour the internet, and you'll find them everywhere. There are much similar groups, smaller groups in private that do not advertise. Some of the groups have an advantage of having access to materials and rituals that others do not by virtue of their geographical location and the makeup of its membership. I have even heard whisperings that some lay claim to an unbroken chain of succession from Pasquale himself, but those are only rumors. This, to my knowledge, has never been proven, either in public or private forums, but although unlikely, it's not impossible. In any case, these groups, like any other gathering of men and women, even our craft, developed and are still working what is known as the egregore. An egregore, if you're not familiar with the term, is a type of group mind or thought form created when people of a like mind gather together with a common purpose. Freemasonry has a group mind or egregore. As a generality, that each individual lodge also has its own egregore, made up and created by its members. Now let's suppose, for argument's sake, that the original Kohen were indeed all gone and the transmission was lost to time. The modern groups can and still do create their own egregore by their united thoughts, words, and deeds. And this egregore built by these individuals can do much as your own lodge does. As Masons, if any of you are paying attention to what happens in your lodge, you will note that the egregore indeed attracts people to you and it expels them. Sometimes you don't even have to do anything, it just happens. This happens every day in our own groups, and these modern groups that have taken on the moniker of Kohen have developed their own, with their own aims and purposes, and continue to work for what they deem to be the betterment of humanity as a whole and reintegration as individuals. In the end, all of our different means are used to achieve the same end. For the Kohen, it's the reintegration or reunion to a lost state. As Masons, we also search for that which was lost. We use allegory and symbol to convey these teachings, whereas the Kohen were operative rather than speculative, so that they will hopefully tend to stay with us longer.